She stood at the back of the grand hall, a ghost in a gray uniform, holding a single, perfect white gardenia. Not for the bride. For the groom. Tears tracked clean paths through the dust on her cheeks, silent and hot. The organ swelled, a prelude to a lie, and every head turned towards the towering oak doors at the end of the aisle. They were waiting for the vision in white, the blushing bride. Ilara was waiting for the world to end. His world. Because she was the only one who knew the wedding was a sham, the bride was a viper, and the man waiting at the altar, a man who had never once looked her in the eye, was about to be utterly destroyed. And she, the maid, the invisible girl who scrubbed his floors and polished his silver, was the only one who could stop it. But to do that, she would have to walk down that aisle herself. And ruin everything to save him. But before the tears, before the gardenia, before the awful, earth-shattering choice, there was the quiet desperation of a Tuesday morning. The smell was the first thing. Bleach. Ammonia. The sharp, industrial tang of a war against filth. It clung to Ilara's clothes, embedded itself in the cuticles of her raw, red hands, and lived in the back of her throat. It was the scent of her life. Her shoes squeaked a sad, rhythmic complaint against the polished marble of the service corridor. Squeak. Rent was due. Squeak. Mama's prescription needed a refill. Squeak. The universe didn't care. The floor stretched on, a gleaming, indifferent expanse of black and white. Julian Croft's penthouse was less a home and more a monument to success. It was a cold, quiet space of glass and steel perched high above the city, a fortress against the noise and the grime Ilara inhabited. She'd been cleaning it for 6 months, part of a high-end crew that descended twice a week to erase any evidence of human life. She was good at her job. Too good. She didn't just clean, she observed. She saw the story in the smudges. The faint ring of condensation from a glass of scotch left on an end table told her he'd been up late. The nearly invisible scuff of a heel near the balcony door spoke of agitation, a pacing man. The single strand of long, blonde hair on the dark leather of his office chair was not his. It belonged to Isabel. Isabel Vance. The fiancée. A woman who seemed less like a person and more like a carefully curated collection of expensive tastes. Her scent was always jasmine and entitlement. Her laughter was like the chime of tiny, sharp bells. She moved through the penthouse not as if she lived there, but as if she were assessing it for its resale value. Ilara saw things. She saw the way Isabel's smile never quite reached her eyes when Julian entered a room. She saw the almost imperceptible tightening of her grip on her phone. She saw the faint, almost erased lipstick mark on a discarded napkin that was a shade Isabel never, ever wore. These were just details. The debris of other people's lives. It was her job to remove them, not to catalog them. Her job was to remain invisible. A ghost in gray. Her own life was a litany of urgent, screaming needs. The eviction notice was tucked inside her worn copy of 100 Years of Solitude, its stark, official font a brutalist poem against the magic of the prose. 72 hours, it said. A lifetime and no time at all. Mama's cough had a new, rattling edge to it, a sound that sent shards of ice through Ilara's veins every time she heard it over the phone. So she scrubbed. She polished. She made herself smaller and smaller, hoping to shrink past the notice of landlords and fate. Her world was the grit under her fingernails, the ache in her lower back, the constant, humming anxiety that was the background music to her every waking thought. Julian Croft was an abstraction. A name on a paycheck. A source of the expensive trash she emptied. He was tall, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to be perpetually focused on a distant horizon she couldn't imagine. He was a presence of quiet, coiled intensity. When he was home during their cleaning shifts, the air itself felt different. Thicker. Charged. He never spoke to her. Not once. He addressed her supervisor, a crisp woman named Maria, but the cleaning crew itself was part of the furniture. Less than the furniture. The furniture had value. This particular Tuesday, the air in the penthouse was stale with tension. A meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. A big one. The experts were already there, clustered in the cavernous living room. They were men in sharp suits with the predatory confidence of sharks who had never missed a meal. They spoke in low, urgent tones, their voices clashing with the sterile perfection of the space. At the center of it all was a box. It wasn't a large box. It sat on the massive granite coffee table, squat and unimpressive. It was made of a dull, dark wood, bound with tarnished brass. It looked old, ancient even. It was a locked box. And it was, apparently, the source of all the tension. Ilara was on her hands and knees, wiping down the baseboards, her movements slow and methodical. Invisible. She heard snippets of their conversation. No give in the hinges. The locksmith said it's a compression lock. Pre-industrial. He'd have to destroy it to get it open. Destruction is not an option, David. You know that. That was Julian's voice. Low. Frayed. Dangerous. Ilara risked a glance. He was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his back to the room, staring out at the gray city. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides. He was a powerful man made helpless by a simple wooden box. His experts, the men he paid fortunes to, were useless. A safecracker with a PhD in historical mechanisms. A corporate security consultant. A man whose entire job description was problem solver. They buzzed around the box like frustrated flies, tapping it, listening to it with stethoscopes, running scans with devices that whirred and beeped impotently. Ilara went back to her baseboards. It wasn't her problem. Her problems were real. Tangible. An eviction notice. A sick mother. This was a rich man's game. She moved into the master suite to start on the bathroom. Isabel was there, on the phone, her voice a venomous whisper. He's losing his mind over it, she hissed into the receiver. They've been at it for hours. No, of course not. They think it's some kind of antique puzzle, she laughed, that sharp, brittle sound. Let him sweat. It's better this way. By the time he figures it out, it will be too late. The deal will be ours. A pause. Ilara froze, her hand hovering over the chrome faucet, her reflection a blurred shape in the mirror. I know, Isabel continued, her voice dropping lower. I miss you, too. That ridiculous cologne of yours. I can still smell it. Be patient, darling. Soon. She hung up. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Isabel turned, and for a heart-stopping second, her cold blue eyes met Ilara's in the mirror. There was no recognition. No acknowledgement that another human being was in the room. Just a flicker of annoyance, as if she'd spotted a fly. She swept out of the room, leaving the scent of jasmine and betrayal in her wake. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. It was none of her business. It was nothing. A lover's tiff. A secret. Rich people were full of them. She forced herself to focus. The chrome. The porcelain. The immaculate, sterile surfaces. But her mind was snagged on the words. That ridiculous cologne of yours. She had smelled it. Last week. While cleaning this very bathroom. A faint, unfamiliar scent clinging to one of the plush bath mats. It was musky and complex, with notes of sandalwood and something else, something sharp, like gin. It was definitely not Julian Croft's cologne. His was a clean, citrus and cedar fragrance she knew well from handling his laundry. She had paused, registered the foreign scent, and then tossed the mat into the laundry pile. An anomaly. A piece of data without context. Now it had context. She finished the bathroom on autopilot, her thoughts racing. The box in the living room. The desperate men. The impending 2 p.m. deadline. The whispered phone call. The foreign cologne. The pieces were scattered, meaningless on their own, but her mind began to arrange them, to seek a pattern. It was what she did. It was how she understood the world. Through the traces people left behind. Later, as she was emptying the trash from Julian's office, she saw it. Tucked into the side pocket of the bin, not thrown in with the rest of the refuse, was a small, wadded-up piece of paper. A receipt from a high-end chocolatier. Not unusual. But beneath the list of bonbons and truffles was a faint, almost invisible smudge. She carefully picked it up. Her fingers, so accustomed to grime, were surprisingly delicate. She flattened the thin paper. The smudge wasn't ink. It was dark, slightly sticky. She brought it to her nose. The scent was faint, but unmistakable. Burnt sugar. And something else. Something mineral. She looked from the receipt to the living room, where the experts were now packing up their useless equipment, their faces a mask of professional failure. Julian stood alone by the table, staring at the box. His posture was one of utter defeat. The deadline was approaching. The deal, whatever it was collapsing. And Ilara, the invisible girl with the raw hands and the eviction notice, held a sticky, sweet-smelling clue in her hand. A clue the experts, with all their technology and their PhDs, had completely missed. Because they were looking at the lock. They were analyzing the brass. They were scanning the wood. They weren't looking at the dirt. Ilara's mind, a machine honed by years of deciphering stains and smells, began to connect the dots. The box wasn't the kind of thing you'd find in an antique store. It was a family heirloom, maybe. Something passed down. Something with a story. She remembered dusting a collection of old photo albums in the library last month. One of them had been left open. A black and white photograph of a young boy, maybe 10 years old, with Julian's intense eyes, standing proudly next to a formidable-looking woman. His grandmother, the caption read. Beside them, on a table, was the box. It was a memory box. A puzzle box, maybe. The kind a clever grandmother would make for her favorite grandson. Not a fortress to be breached, but a secret to be shared. A game. The experts were trying to pick a lock. They should have been trying to solve a riddle. What kind of riddle? Her eyes landed on the smudge on the receipt. Burnt sugar. She thought of the kitchen. She cleaned it every week. She knew its contents better than her own. She knew Julian Croft had a fondness for a particular brand of expensive, dark roast coffee. He also had a sweet tooth he tried to hide. In the back of a high cabinet, behind the quinoa and the organic oats, was a small, almost forgotten bag of artisanal marshmallows. Marshmallows. Burnt sugar. A memory surfaced. A campfire story from her own childhood. A silly rhyme about a magic box that only opened with a toasted marshmallow. A child's game. It was absurd. It was insane. But the experts had failed. The powerful man was defeated. And she, Ilara, the cleaner, had an eviction notice pressed against a story about a boy who loses his home. What did she have to lose? Her job. Her invisibility. The fragile safety of being unnoticed. She took a deep breath, the scent of bleach and ammonia a familiar, grounding presence. She looked at her hands. Red, chapped, but clean. She thought of her mother's rattling cough. She folded the receipt, tucked it into the pocket of her gray uniform, and walked out of the office. Maria, her supervisor, was gathering the rest of the crew by the service elevator. Ilara, let's go. We're done here. I need a minute, Ilara said, her voice quiet but firm. Maria frowned. Mr. Croft is not in the mood for interruptions. Whatever it is, it can wait. It can't, Ilara said. She didn't wait for permission. She turned and walked towards the living room. Her squeaking shoes sounded like gunshots in the tense silence. Squeak. 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 Every head turned. The failed experts. The security consultant. And Julian Croft. His eyes finally landed on her. For the first time, he truly saw her. A small woman in a shapeless gray uniform. A smudge in his perfect, sterile world. His expression was a mixture of confusion and irritation. What is it? He snapped, his voice a low growl. He was speaking to her. To Ilara. The shock of it almost made her falter. This was the moment. The precipice. She could turn around. Apologize. Vanish back into the service corridors of the world. Or she could speak. She thought of the eviction notice. She thought of her mother. She thought of Isabel's triumphant, cruel whisper. The box, she said, her voice barely a whisper. She cleared her throat, forcing the words out, louder this time. I think I know how to open the box. The The silence that followed was absolute. It was a dense, heavy thing, pressing in on her from all sides. Then, a man in a pinstripe suit, David, the problem solver, let out a short, incredulous laugh. It was a nasty sound. "You," he said, looking her up and down with open disdain. "You're the cleaning lady." The words hung in the air, a casual, brutal dismissal of her entire existence. The cleaning lady. Not a person. A function. Ilara felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. Her hands trembled. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to apologize for her own audacity. She could feel the weight of their judgment, their amusement, their contempt. She was a joke. A momentary diversion from their very important failure. Julian Croft's gaze was unreadable, but his jaw was tight. He hadn't dismissed her. Not yet. He was watching her, waiting. It was Isabel who delivered the killing blow. She had drifted back into the room, drawn by the drama. She stood beside Julian, placing a proprietary hand on his arm. Her eyes, cold and blue as glacial ice, fixed on Ilara. "What is this?" she asked, her voice dripping with condescension. She didn't look at Ilara, but at Julian, as if Ilara were a piece of trash someone had forgotten to take out. "Julian, darling, you have multi-million-dollar security consultants who can't figure this out, and you're going to listen to the help." She finally turned her gaze on Ilara, a slow, deliberate act of cruelty. "You're paid to scrub toilets, not to have opinions. Run along and finish your work. Or perhaps you'd rather finish it somewhere else. Permanently." The threat was unmistakable. Her job. Her meager, essential lifeline. Humiliation washed over Ilara in a sickening wave. It was a physical sensation, a cold dread that started in her stomach and spread through her limbs. She felt small, stupid, and utterly powerless. Isabel's words confirmed everything she believed about herself and her place in the world. She was invisible. She was nothing. Her ideas were trash, just like the things she handled every day. Not the landlord, not the boss, not anybody. They all saw the same thing. The uniform. The squeaking shoes. The ghost. She dropped her gaze to the floor. The marble was perfect, gleaming. She had polished it herself just an hour ago. She could see her own distorted reflection in its surface. A hunched, gray shape. Defeated. "I'm sorry," she murmured, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "I made a mistake." She turned to leave, the sound of David's smug chuckle following her. The squeak of her shoes was the sound of retreat. Squeak. Failure. Squeak. Humiliation. She made it to the edge of the room, her hand reaching for the cool brass of the doorframe that led to the service corridor, her escape route back to invisibility. But then she heard it. A quiet voice, from across the room. Not Julian's. Not Isabel's. Let her try. Ilara froze. It was Mrs. Gable, the head housekeeper. A woman in her late 60s with silver hair pulled into a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. She had been with the Croft family for 40 years, starting as a nanny to Julian's father. She was as much a fixture of the house as the marble floors. She rarely spoke, but when she did, people listened. Even Julian. Mrs. Gable was standing near the entrance to the library, a feather duster held in her hand like a scepter. She had been there the whole time, a silent observer. The wise observer. She had seen Ilara with the photo album. She had seen the quiet, intense focus in Ilara's eyes as she worked. She had seen, perhaps, a flicker of something more than just a cleaner. Isabel scoffed. "Don't be ridiculous, Eleanor. This is serious business." "It is indeed, Miss Vance," Mrs. Gable said, her voice calm and even. "And for 2 hours, I have watched serious men with serious machines fail. What is the harm in 5 more minutes?" She looked directly at Julian. "Your grandmother, Althea, was not a fan of brute force. She appreciated cleverness. She liked games." The mention of his grandmother seemed to land a blow. Julian's expression shifted. The irritation faded, replaced by something else. A flicker of memory. Of curiosity. He looked from Mrs. Gable back to Ilara, who was still frozen by the door, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. He was re-evaluating. Seeing her through Mrs. Gable's eyes, not Isabel's. "What is your name?" he asked. His voice was still rough, but the sharp edge of command was gone. It was a simple question. "Ilara," she whispered. "Ilara," he repeated, testing the sound of it. "You said you know how to open it." "How?" This was it. The point of no return. She could still run. She could still disappear. But Mrs. Gable's intervention, that quiet word of support, had been a lifeline. It was a spark in the suffocating darkness of her humiliation. She took a shaky breath. She thought of the burnt sugar. The campfire rhyme. The photo of the boy with the intense eyes. Her own desperation was a tangible thing. The eviction notice. Her mother's medicine. They were not abstract problems like a locked box. They were matters of survival. What was one more humiliation compared to that? But this wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about the smug look on David's face. It was about the casual cruelty in Isabel's voice. It was about the quiet dignity of Mrs. Gable. It was about proving them all wrong. A sudden, terrifying clarity washed over her. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her gut, but something else was rising to meet it. Resolve. A hard, defiant core she didn't know she possessed. She turned away from the door and walked back towards the center of the room. The squeak of her shoes no longer sounded like a retreat. It sounded like a march. She stopped in front of the coffee table, her gaze fixed on the box. She did not look at Julian or Isabel or any of the men who had scorned her. She looked at the problem. "It's a puzzle box," she said, her voice gaining strength. "A memory box." From his grandmother she risked a glance at Julian. The lock isn't mechanical. It's chemical. And sentimental. David, the expert, snorted. "Chemical. What is that supposed to mean?" "We scanned it for accelerants, for residues. It's clean." "You were looking for the wrong thing," Ilara said simply. She turned to Julian. "Do you still have marshmallows in the kitchen?" "In the high cabinet, behind the oats." The question was so bizarre, southwest out of place, that it stunned them all into silence again. Julian stared at her, his brow furrowed in confusion. Then, a flicker of something, recognition, a long-buried memory, crossed his face. How did you know that?" "It's my job to know where things are," she said. "May I?" She gestured towards the kitchen. He gave a slow, uncertain nod. Isabel grabbed his arm again, her nails digging in. "Julian, this is insane. She's the maid. You're going to let her play with matches in your kitchen based on some half-baked fantasy? The deadline is in 45 minutes. "We are leaving," Julian said, his voice flat and final. He gently but firmly removed her hand from his arm. The gesture was small, but it was a tectonic shift. He wasn't speaking to Ilara. He was speaking to Isabel. He had made a choice. Ilara didn't wait for another word. She walked into the kitchen, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm. Panic. 5 minutes. She was on stage now, the spotlight blinding. She pulled a chair over, climbed onto the counter, and reached into the high cabinet, her fingers finding the familiar crinkle of the bag of artisanal marshmallows. She grabbed a single marshmallow, a long wooden skewer, and a utility lighter from a drawer. Her hands were shaking, but her movements were precise. She skewered the marshmallow. She clicked the lighter, the small flame a brave yellow tongue in the sleek, modern kitchen. She held the marshmallow over the flame, turning it slowly. The sugar began to caramelize, to blacken, the smell of the campfire from her childhood filling the air. The scent of burnt sugar. The scent from the receipt. She walked back into the living room, holding the skewer with its perfectly toasted, slightly smoking marshmallow. Every eye was on her. She knelt by the coffee table. The room was so quiet she could hear the faint hiss of the marshmallow as it cooled. She ignored the incredulous stares, the barely suppressed smirks. She focused on the box. There was a tiny, almost invisible hole near the base of the lock mechanism, no bigger than a pinprick. It wasn't part of the ornamentation. It was a port. An entry point. With a steady hand, she brought the hot, sticky tip of the marshmallow to the pinhole. She pressed it gently. The caramelized sugar, still semi-liquid, was drawn into the hole. For a second, nothing happened. David, the expert, let out a weary, patronizing sigh. See? Nothing. A waste of time. Then, they heard it. A quiet, terrifying click. It wasn't loud. It was a soft, internal sound. The sound of a mechanism, long dormant, releasing. It was the most satisfying sound Alara had ever heard. Slowly, with a faint rasp of old wood on old wood, a hidden seam appeared on the top of the box. A small, square section of the lid popped up by 1/4 of an inch. Stunned silence. It was a thick, profound silence. The kind that follows a lightning strike, when the world holds its breath before the thunder. The sound of shattered assumptions. Alara reached out and lifted the small lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was not a document or a key. It was a single, intricately carved wooden gear. She looked up at Julian. His face was a mask of utter astonishment. The exhaustion, the frustration, it had all been wiped away, replaced by a dawning, incredulous awe. He looked from the open compartment to Alara, and for the first time, he wasn't just seeing a ghost in a gray uniform. He was seeing a person. He was seeing a genius. How, he breathed, the word a ghost of a sound. How did you know? Alara stood up, her composure absolute. The fear had burned away in the flame of the lighter, leaving behind something hard and bright. Your grandmother put a sugar lock on it, she explained, her voice clear and steady. It felt like someone else was speaking. A woman she had never met before. A woman with confidence. It's an old confectioner's trick. A pellet of hardened sugar or salt blocks the tumbler. It won't respond to pressure. It won't respond to vibration. The only thing that can dissolve it is the right solvent, applied directly. In this case, she gestured with the skewer, a specific concentration of heat-liquefied sucrose. Toasted marshmallow. She held up the wadded receipt she had taken from the trash. I found this. It smells of burnt sugar. It made me think. She didn't mention the photograph. She didn't mention the campfire rhyme. She gave them the science, the logic. It was more powerful. David, the expert, stared at the box, his face pale. A sugar lock. I've only read about them in obscure texts. They're nearly impossible to detect without prior knowledge. They just read as a solid obstruction. He looked at Alara, his professional arrogance completely shattered. How could you possibly know that? My grandfather was a baker, Alara said, a half-truth that was simpler than the whole. He liked puzzles. Julian took the wooden gear from her hand. His fingers brushed against hers, and a jolt, a spark of unexpected warmth, shot up her arm. He looked at the gear, then back at the main body of the box. On the side, previously hidden by the seamless construction, was a small, gear-shaped indentation. He fitted the wooden piece into it. With another soft click, the entire front panel of the box fell forward on a hidden hinge. Inside, resting on another bed of velvet, was a sheaf of papers. Old, yellowed documents, tied with a faded silk ribbon. Julian reached for them with a trembling hand. He untied the ribbon and unfurled the top document. It was a deed. An original charter for a parcel of land. Land that was, Alara suddenly realized, the subject of the 2 p.m. deal. The land his rival, Isabel's secret lover, was trying to steal. This box held the original proof of ownership, the one thing that could stop the fraudulent claim. This is it, Julian whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The primary title. Uncontestable, he looked up, his eyes finding Alara's across the room. The distance between them had collapsed. They were the only 2 people in the universe. You did it. The spell was broken by Isabel's sharp, panicked voice. Julian, the meeting. You're going to be late. She was trying to regain control, to pull his attention back to her, away from the maid who had just saved him. But the spell wasn't truly broken. It was remade. Julian didn't even look at her. His gaze was locked on Alara. He saw the smudge of soot on her cheek from the marshmallow. He saw the raw redness of her hands. He saw the quiet, unshakable dignity in her eyes. The elegance of her mind, the poverty of her shoes. And he understood, with a sudden, gut-wrenching clarity, the depth of his own blindness. "Thank you," he said, and the words were imbued with a weight, a sincerity that made them feel like a vow. He turned to his phone, dialing his lawyer, his voice now crisp and commanding, all traces of desperation gone. "Michael, I have the primary title. The original 1887 charter. Yes. In my hand. The deal is off. Prepare a countersuit for fraudulent claim and industrial espionage. And I have a name for you. I want you to find out everything you can about every dealing he's had in the last 5 years." He looked over at Isabel. Her face was a mask of horror. She knew whose name he was about to say. The name of the men she'd whispered to on the phone. The men whose cologne lingered on the bath mat. Julian didn't say the name out loud. He didn't have to. He just held her gaze, and in that moment, her entire world crumbled. She had been caught. Exposed. Not by a private investigator or a security expert, but by the cleaning lady she had tried to have fired for being audacious enough to have a thought. The reversal was swift and brutal. David and his team of experts packed their bags in shamefaced silence, avoiding Ilara's eyes. They had been shown up by a woman with a marshmallow and a baker for a grandfather. Their mystique was shattered. Their fees would, Ilara suspected, be disputed. Isabel tried one last, desperate gambit. Tears. Big, theatrical crocodile tears. "Julian, I don't understand. What's happening? Who is this man?" she cried, clutching at his arm. He looked down at her hand as if it were a snake. "Don't," he said, his voice lethally soft. "Don't touch me," he pulled his arm away. "Mrs. Gable," he said, his voice ringing with authority. "Please have Miss Vance's belongings packed and sent to her mother's house. She will not be staying here tonight. Or any other night. My things." Isabel shrieked, her mask of sorrow dropping to reveal the raw fury beneath. "You can't do this. We're getting married in 3 days." "No," Julian said, his voice flat. "We are not." He turned his back on her, a final, absolute dismissal. "Have security escort her out." The powerful man had been blind, but now he could see. And his judgment was terrible and swift. As Isabel was led away, protesting and threatening, a whirlwind of impotent rage, Julian turned his full attention back to Ilara. The room had emptied. It was just the two of them, and Mrs. Gable, who was watching from the doorway with a small, satisfied smile. He walked towards her, holding the precious documents in one hand. He stopped in front of her, so close she could smell the faint, clean scent of his citrus and cedar cologne, now unadulterated by betrayal. "I don't know what to say," he began, his voice softer now, tinged with disbelief and a deep, resonant gratitude. "You saved me. Not just the deal. Me. From a mistake that would have ruined me." Ilara just nodded, unsure of what to do. The adrenaline was fading, leaving her feeling hollowed out and shaky. She had done it. She had walked into the fire and she hadn't been burned. "My office," he said. It wasn't an order. It was an invitation. She followed him into the spacious office, the place where she usually just emptied the trash. He walked behind the massive desk, but he didn't sit down. He remained standing, putting them on more equal footing. He laid the documents down reverently. "I owe you a debt I can never fully repay," he said. "But I'm going to start." He opened a drawer and pulled out a checkbook. He scribbled quickly, his handwriting a sharp, decisive slash of ink. He tore the check out and held it out to her. Ilara looked at it. The number written on the line had so many zeros she felt dizzy. It was more money than she had ever imagined seeing in one place. It was enough to solve all her problems. The rent. Her mother's medical bills for the rest of her life. A small house. A future. She looked from the check to his face. He was watching her, his expression earnest. He thought this was what she wanted. What she needed. And she did. But something held her back. Accepting that check felt transactional. It felt like payment for a service rendered. Like an extravagant tip for a particularly difficult cleaning job. It would put her right back in her box, just a much more comfortable one. The maid who got lucky. She made a decision. It was perhaps the bravest one she had made all day. She gently pushed his hand, and the check, back towards him. "No, thank you," she said quietly. He stared at her, utterly baffled. "No. Ilara, it's the least I can do. It's life-changing money." "I know," she said. "And I am grateful. But that's not what I want." "Then what?" he asked, completely at a loss. "What do you want? Name it. Anything." She took a deep breath. "I want $742, she said, her voice clear and precise. He blinked. "I'm sorry." $742, she repeated. "For my rent. It's due tomorrow. And I want you to call your doctor and arrange for a consultation for my mother. She has a persistent respiratory condition, and I think she needs a specialist." She paused, then added, "And I want a new pair of shoes. These squeak." She looked down at her worn-out shoes, and for the first time, she felt no shame. They were the shoes of a survivor. Julian was speechless. He stared at her, a storm of emotions crossing his face. Confusion. Disbelief. And then, a deep, profound respect that bordered on reverence. She hadn't asked for a fortune. She had asked for exactly what she needed. She had refused to be defined by his wealth. She had met him on her own terms. She had demonstrated not just cleverness, but a strength of character he had rarely encountered in his own world of grasping, ambitious people. He slowly tore up the check, the sound of the ripping paper a final punctuation mark on the day's events. "All right," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. It was the first time she had ever seen him smile. It transformed his severe features, making him look younger, more human. "All right, Ilara." He picked up his phone. He made 2 calls. The first was to his bank, arranging the transfer. The second was to the top pulmonologist in the city. When he was done, he looked at her again. The power dynamic in the room had been irrevocably altered. She was no longer the invisible maid. He was no longer the abstract, powerful boss. They were 2 people who had seen something essential in each other. "That's the immediate problem," he said. "But we have a long-term one. You can't keep cleaning my apartment." Ilara's heart sank. Of course. It would be too awkward now. She was fired after all. "I understand," she said, her voice flat. "No," he said quickly, seeing her expression. "No, you don't understand. I'm not firing you. I'm promoting you. Effective immediately, you work for me. Directly." "Doing what?" she asked, bewildered. "What you just did," he said, his eyes intense. "You see things other people miss. You see the story in the details. In the dirt. I have a company full of experts, analysts, consultants. They look at spreadsheets and data streams. They missed Isabel completely. They would have missed this," he gestured to the box. "You didn't. That skill, it's priceless. I want you to be my consultant. My advisor. My secret weapon. A new job. A new life." Offered to her not out of pity, but out of genuine need for her unique talent. It was more than she had ever dared to dream of. "I don't have a degree," she said, the old insecurities whispering at the edges of her newfound confidence. "I just clean." "You have a PhD in reality," he countered. "That's more valuable than any business degree. We'll figure out the title later. For now, your first assignment is to help me vet every single person in my inner circle. And my first question is this," he leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Mrs. Gable. Can she be trusted?" Ilara thought of the quiet, firm intervention. The lifeline. Implicitly, she said without hesitation. "She saw me before you did." He nodded, accepting her judgment as final. "Good. Then you'll be working with her," he paused. "Your salary will be commensurate with your new position. And it will be significantly more than $742. A new world was opening up, a world she had only ever viewed from the outside, through polished glass. And she was being invited in. Not as a servant, but as a partner. Okay, she whispered, the single word holding the weight of her past and the promise of her future. Okay. The next 3 days were a blur. The wedding was, of course, cancelled. A brief, sterile announcement was sent out citing irreconcilable differences. The gossip columns went wild with speculation, but the truth, the real, sordid story of betrayal and espionage, remained contained within the walls of the penthouse. Isabel vanished. Her social media went dark. Her name disappeared from the society pages. Julian Croft was ruthless in his efficiency. He dismantled her life with the same precision he used to run his empire. The men she had been conspiring with, a rival developer named Marcus Thorne, found himself suddenly besieged by lawsuits and federal investigations. His empire, built on stolen information and deceit, began to crumble. Ilara watched it all from her new, surreal vantage point. She had an office now. A small one, next to Mrs. Gable's, but it had a window. She had a laptop and a phone that didn't belong to a prepaid plan. Most importantly, she had a purpose. Her first few days were spent in quiet observation. Julian had her sit in on meetings, not to contribute, but simply to watch. To listen. To see what the spreadsheets didn't show. She would sit in a corner, quiet and unassuming, and take notes. Not on the business projections, but on the people. She noticed the way a senior vice president's eye would twitch when a certain project was mentioned. She saw the faint sheen of sweat on the brow of a department head who claimed his numbers were solid. She heard the almost imperceptible tremor in the voice of a supplier trying to explain a delay. These were the smudges, the stray hairs, the lipstick stains of the corporate world. And she could read them all. After each meeting, she would debrief with Julian. He would listen, his focus absolute, as she pointed out the tiny inconsistencies, the tells that his high-powered executives didn't even know they were giving. Finch is lying about the South American projections, she said one afternoon. He kept touching his tie every time he said the word stabilized, and his right foot was tapping. He's nervous. He's hiding a loss. Julian had his forensic accountants dig into Finch's division. They found a multi-million-dollar hole, cleverly hidden. Finch was fired. Ilara had saved the company a fortune. Her reputation within the small circle that knew of her new role grew. She was no longer the maid, she was the analyst, or sometimes, in hushed, respectful tones, the oracle, the woman who could see the truth. She and Julian fell into a new rhythm. Their relationship was professional, but it was underpinned by the intensity of what they had been through. There was a current of something else beneath the surface. A shared intimacy born of crisis and revelation. He made good on his promises. Her mother saw the specialist and was diagnosed with a treatable, but serious, condition. With the best care, her prognosis was excellent. The relief was a physical thing for Ilara, a loosening of a knot she had carried for years. And the shoes. One evening, he dismissed his driver and drove her himself to a quiet, ridiculously expensive boutique. The kind of place she used to press her nose against the glass of. Pick whatever you want, he said, standing by the door. She walked through the store, touching the soft leather, smelling the rich, chemical-free scent of quality. She didn't pick the flashiest heels or the most fashionable boots. She chose a pair of simple, elegant, dark blue leather flats. They were beautifully made, practical, and silent. When she wore them to the office the next day, she walked down the marble hallway without a single squeak. The silence felt like power. 6 months passed. The city outside her window shifted from the gray of winter to the tentative green of spring. Ilara's life had transformed so completely it sometimes felt like a dream. She had moved into a comfortable apartment in a safe neighborhood. Her mother was living with her, her health improving daily. The copy of 100 Years of Solitude now sat on a new bookshelf, the eviction notice long since burned. Her role in Julian's company had solidified. She was his most trusted advisor. He didn't make a major move without consulting her. Her insights, born from a lifetime of observing human frailty from the ground up, were his greatest strategic advantage. The professional partnership had deepened. They often worked late, ordering in food and talking for hours. He told her about his childhood, about his formidable grandmother who had taught him that the most complex locks often have the simplest keys. She told him about her love of books, about her father who had taught her to read before she could walk, about the quiet, fierce pride of her family. He no longer saw her as the maid. He saw her as Ilara. Brilliant, perceptive, and possessing a core of integrity that humbled him. And she no longer saw him as the abstract, powerful boss. She saw Julian. Intense, driven, but also capable of a surprising gentleness and a dry, self-deprecating wit. She saw the man who had been willing to listen when the whole world was telling him not to. One rainy Friday night, they were the last two in the office. They were looking over blueprints for a new philanthropic project he was funding, a network of libraries in underserved communities. It had been her idea. "You know," he said, his voice quiet, "I've been thinking about that day." "I try not to," she said with a small smile. "I do," he insisted. "All the time. I think about what would have happened if you hadn't spoken up. If Mrs. Gable hadn't intervened. If I hadn't listened," he shook his head. "My whole life would be a lie. I would be married to a woman who despised me, who was actively working to destroy me. And I would have been too blind to see it." He turned from the blueprints to look at her. The city lights glittered behind him, a constellation of possibilities. "You didn't just save my company, Ilara. You saved me. And I've been trying to figure out how to thank you for that for the last 6 months." "You have," she said softly. "You gave me a new life." "That was just a transaction," he said, echoing her own thoughts from that first day in his office. "This is something else." He stepped closer. The space between them, once a vast chasm of class and power, was now barely a breath. He reached out, not for a checkbook, but for her hand. His touch was warm, firm. "I'm not a very good man, Ilara," he said, his voice raw with a vulnerability she had never heard before. "I'm ruthless. I'm demanding. I'm difficult. But I would like to be a better one. With you." It wasn't a declaration of love in the traditional sense. It was something more real. A confession. An offer. A partnership that transcended the boardroom. She looked into his eyes, those same intense eyes that had once looked right through her, and saw her own reflection. Not a ghost in gray. Not a function. A woman. Whole and seen. "You're not so bad," she whispered. He smiled, that rare, transformative smile. And then he leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of passion or desperation. It was a kiss of recognition. A quiet, certain sealing of a bond forged in a moment of crisis and vindicated over months of mutual respect. It tasted of hope. A year after the non-wedding, Ilara stood on the balcony of the penthouse. It was her home now. Her name was on the lease next to his. The air was warm, smelling of summer rain and the city's endless energy. She held a heavy piece of cardstock in her hand. It was an invitation. Not to a wedding, but to the grand opening of the Althea Croft Memorial Library, the first of the network she had helped create. Her new title was printed beneath his on the foundation's letterhead, Executive Director. Julian came to stand beside her, wrapping an arm around her waist. He rested his chin on her shoulder. "Thinking about things?" he asked softly. "Always," she murmured, leaning back against him. On a small table beside them sat the wooden box. It was open. She sometimes kept her favorite pens in it. A memento. A reminder. A trophy. She had kept one other thing from her old life. Tucked away in her closet, carefully cleaned and preserved, was a simple, gray uniform. A reminder of where she came from. A reminder that being invisible is not the same as being powerless. And that sometimes, the person everyone overlooks is the only one who can truly see. He kissed the side of her head. "Happy anniversary," he whispered. "Anniversary of what?" she asked. "The day you almost ruined your life." "No," he said, turning her to face him. His eyes were full of a love that was steady and sure. "The day you saved mine." And in the quiet of their shared home, high above the city that had once seemed so vast and indifferent, the invisible genius and the powerful men who had learned to see were finally, simply, home. She had not just earned her power, she had defined it. She had not just found a partner, she had forged an equal. And the silence was no longer one of invisibility, but of a deep and abiding peace. The world was still full of dirt, of smudges and secrets, but she was no longer afraid of it. she knew how to read it. And she knew how to clean it up.